Please go to our website at www.leonlevycenterforbiography.org or sign up for our mailing list, and you'll be getting these in the mail probably more often than you'd like. We have an all-star panel here, and I'm just going to introduce the moderator who will take care of the other introductions. It's delightful, finally, to have Jay Perini here. He is a member of our board, but he teaches at Middlebury College, so he's not always around New York. He is a most distinguished poet, novelist, and a great biographer of, among others, John Steinbeck, Robert's younger brother, Robert Frost, William Faulkner, a wonderful book on Faulkner, I think the best of all of them, and most recently, a short biography of Jesus. His biographical novels include Benjamin's Crossing, The Passages of H.M., and The Last Station, a novel of Tolstoy's last year, which was made into a successful film in 2009, and he's now working on a biography of Gore Vidal. Please welcome Jay Perini.
Well, thanks. It's great fun to be here, and Gary, I appreciate the introduction. I'm glad to be on the board of this Biography Center, which I admire immensely, and I wish I could make the meetings more frequently, but it's a long drive from Vermont. I just made it today, and I'm delighted to be on this panel tonight with my old friend Susan Cheever over here, who's written a wonderful biography of E.E. Cummings, and here we have Hans Bach from the Netherlands, who's edited this massive, marvelous collection of letters by Malcolm Cowley to various important literary intellectuals from the 20th century. And right on my left here, I have Dorothy Gallagher, who's written a very brilliant life, I think, of Lillian Hellman. I just read these books last week. And I'm delighted to be with these people to talk about a subject kind of fun, I think, that was the title which was thrown at me, and it seemed like a good one, The Fragility of Literary Fame. As Gary mentioned, I'm working on Gore Vidal at the moment, and having just finished Jesus. It does seem incongruous, doesn't it? I was just giving a talk in Key West, and someone said to me, gosh, you're going from Jesus to Gore Vidal. What's the difference between those guys? And I said, well, put it this way, Jesus didn't think he was Gore Vidal. But, and it's
good one.
It's true. How literary fame evaporates is a subject that fascinated Gore, in fact. In our thousands of phone calls, I knew him for 30 years, talked to him on the phone every week, sometimes every day, for years. He would always talk about the great eraser, history, which and he was so terrified of himself being obliterated. And he talked about this amazing obliteration of the past. Remember 10 years ago exactly, in fact, I brought out an edition I was general editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Literature in many volumes. And I remember for weeks sitting down with my board of advisors and fellow editors, sub-editors, and we blocked out America in decades, starting in 1620 and going up to the present. And we said, okay, let's figure out who really should be covered in the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Literature from each decade. And it's a really, I would recommend it. It's a terrifying exercise to see, what is forgotten. And the question is, what is remembered is the hard part. As I've been teaching for 40 years, I remember 40 years ago, I was working on as a junior professor at Dartmouth in 1974 or 5. I was writing an article which I was trying to publish called The Critical Reception of Wallace Stevens. In those days, I would do something like that. And I remember looking in some journal, and I read a review of Wallace Stevens' book Harmonium, and I loved the line in there. He looks like an interesting, promising poet, this Wallace Stevens, but let's face it, he's no Trumbull Stickney. No Trumbull Stickney. People have often said that about me. But I remember my colleague came into my office that day, an 80-year-old poet in residence at Dartmouth called Dick Eberhardt, Richard Eberhardt, now long forgotten himself. But then he just won the National Book Award for poetry. He had won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. And Oxford had just brought out a biography of Richard Eberhard. Now no one would ever heard of Richard Eberhard, it seems, unless you're really into this history of modern poetry. And I said to Dick, who is Trumbull Stickney? And Dick said, you know, when I was a student at Dartmouth in the early 20s, he said, we all wanted to be the new Trumbull Stickney. And that struck me. And I remember going into teaching a creative writing seminar, my first one at Dartmouth, and I said to the kids, so what are your dreams? Give me your dreams. And a kid raised his hand and said, I would just like to be famous. Like, oh, I don't know, as famous as Michael Shara. And at the time, everybody in the class said, there's no chance we'll ever be as famous as Michael Shara, who had just won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. You laugh. Does anyone here know Michael Shara?
Oh, Michael Shara.
Okay. Sorry, Michael. Oops. But you know what I mean. It's like, you know, okay, here's a guy, everybody in this class wanted to be Michael Shara in 1975. And, you know, few people still know his work, and he's a good writer. But the fragility of literary fame, it's rather daunting to think about. I was just looking at, when we think of the characters that we're talking about here today, E.E. Cummings, I think, is a magnificent poet. But Susan talks, and I'll ask her to elaborate on this, but she talks brilliantly about the vicissitudes of his reputation. I liked your line about how in good times he does well, and in bad times, in times of austerity, not so well. But he is a cheerful poet on some level, and a comforting poet. And in the 60s, when I was in college, he was, you know, on everybody's lips. Everybody had the collected E.E. Cummings in their dorm room. Nowadays, try to find a student. I mean, he's too popular to be taught in universities, as you say, and he's too. I'll let you talk about that, but it's a very curious case. The literary reputation of someone is great, in my view, as E.E. Cummings. And then we have Lillian Hellman, and Dorothy, I think, talks very well about how we were just talking out in the lobby about what she might be remembered for, not maybe The Little Foxes, not maybe one of her dozens of great plays, or maybe not so great plays, maybe not her memoirs, which are more fiction than fact, maybe for her battles with Mary McCarthy, right? That's what I remember her for, mainly. And then we have the curious, interesting case of Malcolm Cowley. I think one of the great literary intellects of the 20th century. Reading these letters, really, Hans, you've unearthed the whole continent of interesting material here. I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody today writing with more severity, honesty, and perceptiveness to important colleagues. He's writing to people we know, perhaps Edmund Wilson, but do we still know? I mean, I know, and you all probably know, because you're all literary types, but who remembers Granville Hicks, Waldo Frank, Benny DeVoto, we probably know, Archibald MacLeish, we know, Kenneth Burke, maybe. How about Hamilton Basso, who was William Faulkner? When I wrote my biography of William Faulkner, I remember he said, I'm terrified of Hamilton Basso, such an important author. Hamilton Basso. Remember.
The View from Pompey's Head.
There we go.
Right. Yeah.
Robert Hillier was someone on the tip of everybody's tongue if you were a literary person in, say, 1935. Not today. So I'm hoping Edmund Wilson might be the only correspondent with Malcolm Cowley that we all know very well. Bernard DeVoto was, of course, an omnipresent, ubiquitous man of letters in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Endless bestsellers, you know, so prominent, but now it'd be very hard to find. Well, just one last thing. I was teaching yesterday at a seminar on modern literature at Middlebury, and I knew this was coming up, and I threw out a couple of names, and I said, just so I have a gauge of where things are standing in recent literature, I said, how many of you have read the work of, say, Norman Mailer? 21 senior English majors at Middlebury College. Not one person could identify Norman Mailer. Not a single one.
Ooh.
Not one. I said, you're kidding me. Armies of the Night? No. The Prisoner of Sex? No. The Deer Park? It doesn't ring a bell. The Executioner's Song? What's that? Nobody had heard of Norman Mailer. So, let's just say the great eraser has been busy. And, sorry, Norman. That's what happens. So Susan, can we start at your end? Because
I'm just ready to shoot myself. I mean, this intro makes me.
right. You ready to shoot
I
yourself?
want to be the new Trumbull Stickney.
The new Trumbull
Yeah.
Stickney.
Nice name that Trumbull Stickney had. What can I say? Nothing
Yeah.
could be more ephemeral than literary fame.
It is sad, but I mean,
Although maybe
what about a man
political
like E.E.
fame is
Cummings, though?
just-
I mean, it is true that those poems will stay with people who are interested in
Well, I think
poetry.
Cummings's reputation, even when he was alive, went up and down very dramatically. I mean, in 1935, he couldn't get a book published. He had won every award. He had published 3 previous books. He had had a bestseller, and then he couldn't get a book published. And he did a perfect Cummings end run. He borrowed $300 from his mother, published it himself, titled it No Thanks, and dedicated it to the 15 publishers who had turned it down. So it's now a kind of fabulous artifact, and I think that's our answer.
Yeah.
Let them forget us.
And let those make their way to the work who do. My feeling is with Cummings, the work is solid enough, it's important enough, there will be people that will make his or her way to the poetry. Don't you think?
I hope so. I mean, the thing about Cummings one of the things that interests me so much is that he really was a formalist. He's so misunderstood.
Yeah.
You know, he had these 2 degrees from Harvard. He knew all this stuff about poetics. He knew a sestina from a villanelle. And you can see him writing a Petrarchan sonnet or an Italian sonnet and then twisting it and twisting it and twisting it to make it more powerful.
Yeah.
And then when you read it, I'm afraid that people just think he threw the words on the page that way, whereas in fact, it's very formal and then it's messed with. So I think it's even possible that Cummings will become more popular and perhaps even be better understood. Although, can I just say one other thing about Cummings? The reason he got so popular in the 50s and 60s, or one of the reasons, 40s and after World War II, is that he became a lecturer and a reader. And this is also why Emerson is remembered. Yes. In other words, here's a path for us writers that we can think about. So Cummings was an inspired lecturer and reader. He rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. He knew to the second how long something was going to take.
Yeah.
If you look at he did a bunch of lectures at Harvard called non-lectures. They're just wonderful. And I think that is one way to, I don't want to say pump up, but that's the thing that sort of brought him back into the public eye. And so in the 60s, when we were all in nursery school reading Cummings,
Yeah.
you know, that's one reason why people knew about him, these readings and these lectures.
But don't you think also, I always thought with Cummings, the poems are so memorable. And Auden defined poetry as memorable language. And I remember in the 60s, I just memorized the work. Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride his water-smooth silver stallion and kill 1, 2, 3, 4 pigeons, just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death?
That's a good one.
Stays with you.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's, I'm not going to counter with "Oh Sweet Spontaneous Earth." How many times?
Anyone lives in a pretty town, they'll stay with you.
They do. They do. They're wonderful. They're wonderful poems. And, you know, I think one thing we need to think about is the different genres. I think,
Sonnets.
well, I also think a poet's fame is different from a novelist's fame, which is perhaps different from a biographer's fame.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how. You're going to tell us.
Poets don't have any fame. I can remember I was flying on an airplane once in the New York Times. I read on the front page, Robert Lowell is dead. And I remember saying to the guy next to me, "Oh my God, Robert Lowell's dead. I didn't know this guy." And he said, "Who's Robert Lowell?" And, you know, outside of a small world, No one knows of a poet.
Well, it's a different kind of fame. Whereas the critics, who, you know, many of the people you're talking about, or who Malcolm wrote to, who subside, that's a different, I think it's for different reasons. I don't know. I mean, I haven't thought about this a lot, but I do think poets have a different kind of fame than critics or novelists or biographers.
Yeah. If they're good, the poems stick in the memory, and they
The
stay
poems
there.
stick in the memory, but also poetry has a resilience, I think, that the other genres don't have. I mean, I know that biography, I don't know if Dorothy agrees with me, is changing so fast, it's hard to even keep track of the changes. Well, I'm sure you'll
Changes
agree
in
with
what?
me. It's changing so fast, biography.
Biography as a
that
genre?
as you write it,
Yeah.
you're even trying to kind of keep up with the new freedoms that are open to you, because, you know, biography is the dowager of nonfiction, and she's coming crashing down with dust coming out of every orifice.
Right.
So, but not so much poetry. In other words, poetry has a constancy to it, and fiction has certainly changed in the last 20 years, but
Yeah.
not poetry so much.
Well, Hans, maybe you can talk about.
Of course, Malcolm
about
was a
Malcolm.
major minor poet himself, but I doubt whether any of his poems will be memorable enough to survive, although he wrote some beautiful ones.
Lou
But as
Juniata.
as a critic, he was very much concerned with this question of the frailty of fame and the building of reputations. You know, why do certain writers build reputations? Why do others sort of seem absolutely adamant not to build a reputation, right? Like Robert Coates or Conrad Aiken, they seem sort of determined not to be successful. But then, of course, Cowley himself was very instrumental in boosting the reputation of a number of better-known writers that, that you
William
have
Faulkner.
not mentioned.
In many ways,
William
we might
Faulkner,
not
of
even know
course.
William Faulkner now if it weren't for Cowley's great editing.
But
And
also Ernest Hemingway.
my father.
John Cheever. He published John Cheever for the very first time when he had just been kicked out of high school at the age of 17. His very first short story published in the New Republic. And he continued to be a very solid champion of Cheever throughout his writing
Absolutely.
life. But then there's Ernest Hemingway, you know, a famous first portrait in Life magazine. There's Fitzgerald, there's Hart Crane, there's Ken Kesey, you know, whom he helped to get published. There's Jack Kerouac's On the Road, whom he sort of, you know, brought to Viking. So there's a number of very famous names that I think we all still remember, right? I hope at least. That Cowley also sort of was instrumental for. Then, of course, the question also is, then what about Malcolm Cowley himself? You know, do we still remember him? And if so, why not? So since I started working on Cowley in the late 70s, early 80s, and I discovered this wealth of material that was at the Newberry Library in Chicago, I've been absolutely astounded why nobody in the United States would want to focus on this very instrumental networker and builder of reputations and canon maker in American literature. And I still actually don't quite know the answer to that. What I do know is that I was fortunate enough to get to know Malcolm during the last 10 years of his life. I gained his trust, and I suspect that one of the reasons why I did gain his trust was the fact that I was not an American, that I was outside of the fray, outside of the whole political battles that were being waged in the American literary situation, and that Cowley felt sort of, here's maybe a person who, taking an outside view, can sort of, you know, at least place me and sort of evaluate my importance with some degree of justice. I'm not entirely sure. Let's hope. At least the one thing I tried to do with my book is to present an image of Cowley that was not partial. I mean, what I've noticed is that most people, if they know about Malcolm Cowley at all, know about the Cowley of the 1920s, or they know about the Cowley of the 1930s who made grievous political mistakes, and they tend to highlight that. Especially for some reason, New York critics tend to sort of take that approach. Very few people know about the Malcolm Cowley and what he did, you know, and the extensive network of contacts that he built after 1945. And I think one of the things I tried to sort of, you know, the story I tried to tell in my book is that after 45, the story of Cowley's career is a double tale of success and failure. I mean, the failure has to do with the political past, obviously, the fact that he continued to defend Stalin much longer than was good for him, the fact that he sort of, you know, did not see through the Moscow trials in the late 1930s, that he was very late in acknowledging he had been wrong there. He didn't really sort of own up to this publicly until the 1970s or 1980s, when he did write a number of very open and honest essays about these topics. So a double tale of failure, and his political past kept on haunting him throughout the post-war years, to the point where he never was able to finish his memoirs of the late 1930s.
It's so interesting because Cummings got criticized for seeing what Stalin was up to too soon. I mean, you couldn't go right there.
Yeah, that is certainly true. It's a very complicated decade, and also to estimate this, you have to be sort of, very careful also to make pronouncements. But on the one hand, then we have the political story, which continues through the Cold War years, but in private, let's say. On the other hand, we have the successful story of his rehabilitation, right? Beginning with the portrait of Max Perkins, which he did for the New Yorker, beginning with the Portable Cowley, which he did in 1946, which indirectly helped to get Faulkner to the Nobel Prize in 1950. And then sort of going on from there, he did a new edition of Tender is the Night by Scott Fitzgerald, very controversial. But it remains in print. I mean, even today, the Penguin Classics edition of Tender is the Night is the Cowley edition, although it doesn't acknowledge it publicly, but it is the Cowley edition. So these two sides of Cowley's fame and lack of fame are very intriguing, I think, to sort of ponder. As is the question, why does it take a European from the Netherlands of all countries, right, to put him in the limelight again? If you have an answer, I'd be very happy.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, we'll circle back to everybody, but let's talk for a moment to Dorothy about the subject.
Let me just ask you, there is no biography of Cowley?
Not really. What I did was a critical biographical study of his formative years, which was my dissertation way back when. The very first attempt that has been made to sort of present the full arc of Cowley's life is the selection of letters that I've edited. But I'm hoping that this will be a stepping stone to a biography eventually. But there's easily 5 or 6.
Which you will write. We hope you'll write the book, Hans. Eh?
I'd be happy to try it.
So Dorothy, let's talk about Lillian Hellman.
Okay. I was quite surprised earlier today. I was talking to Gary before the panel, and he said I expected a mean and acerbic biography, and I was quite astonished because I had done my best to write such a biography of Lillian Hellman. But I think I'm probably the only biographer I know who has gone into a subject without really liking her subject. And the things I knew about Lillian Hellman when I began disposed me not to like her as a person and not to be very admiring of her writing either. Did you want to ask me a question?
No, you keep talking.
No, ask me a question.
Well, why?
Yeah, tell us about about what happened with you and Lillian Hellman as you wrote.
Oh, she was an assignment, really. I mean, I didn't choose her. She was an assignment, which I took.
But you didn't find her repellent.
I found her more, well, there are many things I could say about Lillian Hellman. I was interested in, she's had many biographies. She did not want her biography written ever. She destroyed a lot of papers, all her papers. She urged her friends not to talk to inquiring strangers. She did everything she could not to have a biographer. She wanted her memoirs to stand for her biography and her work to stand for her biography. In fact, she's had 4 well, mine isn't a full-scale biography, but she's had 4 full-scale biographies, and she's had many subsidiary biographies. For example, The Cold War Romance of Lillian Hellman and John Melby, and books about her, and a book about her and Dashiell Hammett, her relationship with Hammett. So she's had many, many works, which really made things easier for me. Because the material, the basic material, was all there. I was interested in 2 things about Hellman. One that had never been covered before, which was her, the life of her immigrant great-grandfather in the Deep South, in a place called Demopolis, Alabama, to which he came in 1840 And that was fascinating to me, the Jewish life in the South, when he was probably the only Jew in town and made his fortune there. And I was interested in her politics, which were like Cowley's, except that she held on to them a great deal longer than Cowley did. So those were the two things I concentrated on, and they didn't endear me to her. I mean, the politics did not further endear her to me.
What do you think she's going to be known for
I think
in decades to come, if anything? Will she be completely forgotten? Or will anybody watch her put on and watch her plays? Or will her memoirs be read?
I think her memoirs will be assigned in schools, although they have a blot on them. They're not true. I mean, they're not.
Wasn't it Mary McCarthy who said every single word in those memoirs is a lie, including the and and?
Right.
I think she said every word she writes.
But is that the blot?
And
No. Is
what?
that the blot?
Is it a blot? Not to tell the truth?
Is that when you say they have a blot on them, what are you referring to?
I'm referring to their untruth. You can't take for granted anything, as Mary McCarthy
that's
said, anything she writes. She has a black nurse when she's a girl whom she idolizes, she says. I think there probably was a nurse who left when Hellman was still in her infancy. I don't think this was a nurse who, as she says, persisted into her childhood. But there's no way to check that. There's no way ever to know that. But you begin to doubt every word, everything she writes. And when you start reading her, knowing certain things are certainly untrue, everything starts to seem untrue.
Mm.
But how truthful are memoirs ever? I mean, if you're a biographer of somebody who specializes in autobiography, in a way like Malcolm Cowley, you're going to continuously walking that thin line between, what you have found is to be true from the documentary record and what your subject tells us has happened in his memoirs or his autobiography. And then, of course, you get to the point where, if you're lucky enough to actually meet with your subject, you ask him about certain features and facts, and you find that the memory of Cowley in this case is entirely off in terms of, the facts that you've discovered. So,
what Dorothy's saying is really interesting because, as a memoirist, which is not why I'm here, but I think that it's my obligation to write the truth as well as I can, knowing that memory is a fallible instrument, knowing that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, or I hope that, because of that, I have enough authority as a writer so that people don't doubt every single thing I say. But I think what Dorothy is saying, or what I heard her say, is that once you know that somebody's made up a couple whoppers in their memoir, then the game, you can no longer, they lose their authority. So you don't want to believe them anymore. So that's a different thing than the shadings of memory, I think.
Yeah.
Once you know that she just made up that whatever it is, then...
Yeah, that has a name, and it's called fiction.
Exactly. And once you start suspecting
she could have called it fiction.
But if you go, if you walk into a bookstore in Israel, for example, I remember going in there once, and I said, "Where's your fiction section?" And they said, a guy said, "Oh, we don't have the word in Hebrew. We only have one category, siporet, and it covers history, memoir, and fiction."
Wow.
We don't make a distinction, and I said, "You don't?" And he said, "Well, it's all simply an arrangement of details." And he pointed out that the word fictio is the Latin word which means to shape. And so I regard all history and fiction as essentially shaped narratives, which may have some tangential relationship with this thing we call reality or not. I remember once I was having lunch with our mutual friend Erica Jong with Gore Vidal, and Gore turned to Erica and said, "So Erica, what are you doing next?" She said, "Well, I'm going to write my memoirs." And Gore said, you're going to turn your hand to fiction. And
Well, but people
Yes.
live and die by these distinctions in this country.
Yes,
it's a
I
mistake,
agree.
though. Doesn't
No,
make
it's
it
not.
doesn't
Maybe
make
it
it
is,
true.
but in fact, if you're a memoirist and you write fiction, Random House will shred your book. I mean, this is
True.
not.
That's
we
true.
take this very seriously.
Right, but nevertheless, I'm just trying to point to the fact that all narrative involves suppression of certain details
Absolutely.
and heightening of other details, and involves an arrangement of the facts, right? To emphasize something and de-emphasize purposefully or unconsciously something else.
Right, but then
It's different from just bold lying,
fact,
which
we
our friend
don't
Lillian
really-
here did.
we believe that in this country, but we also believe that there is a sharp distinction between a memoir in which you use remembered details
Yeah.
to shape a story and a book in which you make up details to shape a story. And when the writer gets confused, it's over. The writer gets fired, pilloried, the book is shredded. I mean,
Right.
this isn't something
You've
we
got to
take lightly.
understand
Sued.
the territory.
Sued, exactly.
There's a wonderful thing that a writer called Timothy Garton Ash wrote.
Yeah, the
Once-
Stasi files.
Yes, he said, if you're a reporter and you're reporting from in some foreign country, and you're just on the border, and you see just over the border, there's a beautiful flower. And if you just think, well, I'll go over and pick it, and I'll put it on my side of the border, and it will make the story come to life. You've crossed a serious line. And I think the distinction we have to make, you're right, everything is shaped. Everything is, we make narratives out of everything. When we talk to ourselves at night inside our heads, we're making a narrative, we're telling a story. But I think we have to keep that distinction between making up and telling what we remember.
Or maybe a
A sharp
distinction between setting out to make things up and just making things up in the way that the mind does.
I can't get halfway through my Cummings biography and say to myself, well, wouldn't it be nice if he didn't lose his daughter and he saw her
Yeah.
after 6 months instead of 20 years? Hey, let's make this a little nicer for him. I mean, you're not the book gets shredded, you get sued, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not.
Biography is complicated. I've often wondered about. I mean, biography is in many ways the least theorized of all genres, and
What do you
I've
mean the
often
least
wondered about
theorized?
thought about in an abstract way,
Okay.
and in its principles really taken down to the fundamentals, and really understood in theoretical terms, the way poetry and
Thank
fiction
God.
are theorized. You say thank God, but the truth is, what we've had is generations of biographers who've been very naive.
It's
And
about
for
to
example,
change.
it's about to change? Well, we've had generations of biographers who are very naive for example, they think that if you've interviewed 1,000 people, you've got these interviews, that's fact. But remember, an interview is often false. It's often a piece of fiction. It's often an ill-remembered moment.
Thank God.
And in working, for example, in all the biographies I've done, I had a terrible time with the John Steinbeck biography because people kept coming to me with memories. One woman out in Monterey kept saying, "Oh, he sat in the bar with me, Steinbeck, and here's what he told me," and she lavished all this stuff on me, and I taped it all, and I transcribed it, and then I discovered at one point she didn't even live in Monterey at that time. And so it was all fantasy. And the truth. And so what's the ontological status of fact in biography is something that needs severe questioning. I think, and also, again, understanding biography as fiction, as a shaped narratives, has to be brought into play here because so much biography has an agenda,
But
ideological.
you just made a 10-foot jump. In other words, yes, we need to consider it, but that doesn't mean it's fiction. I think, let's talk about plagiarism, okay? So another person who had written a biography of Cummings was accused of plagiarism and essentially his career destroyed. And as you know, I'm sure, this is not a secret exactly.
Right.
And so when I was reading the books, his book and the other biographies that he supposedly had plagiarized from, and you know, in a biography you get inside that stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think he did plagiarize. And what is plagiarism anyway? It's failure to credit. In other words, we all, you know, a guy named Richard Kennedy wrote a biography of Cummings in 1980, and he interviewed everyone, and they were still alive. So we can't do that.
Right.
We have to take his interviews. There's no way around it.
So
But we
can't
credit
know,
him.
We can't
say
know if
that.
those interviews are actually remotely
We
accurate.
can't even know if they're true. But we can say Kennedy interviewed this person, and this is what this
is what
person
he
told
says the person
Kennedy.
said.
But we're plagiarizing. We're just crediting. So that's why we get out of this terrible label.
You're not plagiarizing.
Yeah, it would be plagiarizing. In other words, how many footnotes do you have to have so that it's not plagiarism?
I think you have to be, I think common sense comes into play. You have to say where you got something from. If you got it
Absolutely.
from somewhere. That's all that's involved there.
But the first
unless you're
part
writing
of-
The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot,
Talk about plagiarism.
which is basically it's a tissue of quotations.
Right.
There's hardly a line in The Wasteland that isn't a line from somebody else.
But these are acknowledged quotations.
No, they're
Some are,
not.
some
No, they're
aren't.
not.
Yeah.
Some are, some
look,
aren't.
Look at the best lines in The Wasteland. I had
Right.
not thought death had undone so many. I thought that is the greatest line ever written. And it's Dante, of course, when he looks into hell, speaks it to Virgil. And it's simply Longfellow's translation of Dante. And there's no acknowledgement. And Eliot didn't think for a second about this, right? He gives you, you know, dozens of footnotes at the end, which are inaccurate, and they're whimsical. They often don't
Right.
refer to the true text. And at one point, he gives you a footnote which gives you 47 lines in Latin, which don't relate to anything in the text.
But let me ask you, if you have no confidence in being able to get at a truth or
Okay.
some truth about Gore Vidal, why are you doing this biography?
Because I think that what we're doing is trying to get at the imagined truth.
The imagined
The imagined truth. I think we're trying, in a biography, we are creating a marvelous chimera, a kind of, it's a parallel, it's a hologram, it's a text that shimmers, and it exists in some strange relationship to the life that might have taken place. And I for instance, if someone writes a biography of Susan Cheever in 20 years, and you come back, or I'm not going to say you're dead, but let's just say you're dead, and you come back from the dead, and you read your own biography, I'll bet you would be shocked at what you would see. You would say, but it wasn't like that at all.
Right, but we all
Right?
understand.
So it
because
doesn't. So in other words, it bears no relationship to what you
But
in
the
your
facts
heart
would
of
be
hearts
the same. But the
imagined was
facts-
your life.
The facts would be the same.
Yeah.
In other words, thanks to Janet Malcolm, we all know that what the writer writes has nothing to do with what the subject tells them to write. Okay.
There's a thing called the agreed upon facts. Born, died, married, went to Bryn Mawr from 1960 to 1964, and I think you can't screw with the
But
agreed upon
I
facts.
think that you're really, I mean, the agreed upon facts are a multitude. They're not just what you're saying. There are huge
That's
numbers of
right.
agreed
There is
upon
a record.
facts.
There is a
In other words,
documentary record of anybody you're going to write about. I mean,
In Malcolm Cowdery's case, the documentary record is immense. I mean, he kept virtually every scrap of paper and the
So you
Cowdery
stick to all
collection
these
just
facts
that.
and you lose the life of the person
No,
that's
he
writing
won't.
it.
No,
So you
he
have to
won't.
That's
reimagine,
yet another
to
subject.
reconstruct it imaginatively. I like your phrase chimera, the mystery of the life is
whoever
what we
writes my biography,
Yeah.
should anybody do it, no chimera.
Then you're getting, but then you're getting no life.
what will your subtitle
I'll take my
be?
chances.
There won't be a life. There cannot be a biography that's not an immense, brilliant work of fiction.
What will your subtitle be of your life of Gore Vidal?
I'm going to call the book, but I have to ask if my editor if this is okay, but I want to call it Empire of Self, A Life of Gore Vidal.
Nice.
You will call it A Life of Gore Vidal.
I will call it A Life of Gore Vidal because I understand what it means to say a life of somebody, and that it doesn't mean that you're standing in that person's shoes and going to the bathroom with them and going to the laundry with them or sitting at all the dinners with them or jumping into bed with them or whatever.
No,
I mean,
you're
it's
telling
never
a
that.
story. You're telling a
and
story out of the
You're
facts.
picking out of the zillion possible
That's
facts
right.
there.
That's
You're
right.
plucking a tiny percentage of them, and you're
Right.
creating this marvelous work, which is going to suppress tremendous amount of stuff.
Absolutely.
Because it'll have an ideological bias, which you don't even know what it is.
Right, but those facts are facts. In other words, you take one fact out of a gazillion and you use that fact, that detail, to shape the story which you think is the story of that person's life, but you don't make that fact up. And that's the difference.
Well, you know, try reading biographies closely sometimes. I taught a biography seminar once. Over and over again, you come upon lines like, you know, Joe Schmo crossed the street. It was raining. He was depressed.
Well,
How does the person know he was depressed?
a letter. I crossed the street tonight.
99%
I was
of the
raining
time,
and I was depressed.
people are making judgments all the time about how the character in the book, not the person, felt. And that's, for the most part, a wild assumption. And so I think that the problem with me is that biographers are unconscious fiction writers. I think they should become more conscious fiction writers.
think they're
and therefore
conscious.
understand the difference between agreed upon facts and the creation of a narrative.
Well, the problem with me is I think they're unconscious plagiarists. So between us, we're really
Who's an unconscious plagiarist?
biographers.
What are they plagiarizing?
Everything. In other words, when you write a
credit.
biography, you're taking the 10 previous biographies, sucking them dry,
Yeah.
and then you're going to some archive and sucking it dry. That's plagiarism.
Well, even if you write the first biography of somebody, then you're copying their life.
Exactly.
You're sticking them in a Xerox machine.
Exactly. Exactly.
Producing them.
Exactly.
I think that's not true at all.
But I
disagree
really
100%.
think there's a difference between
I don't think I think that that's completely
the
nonsense.
shaping that goes on with fiction and the shaping that goes on with nonfiction.
I think that I think we have to remember as Borges once said in his wonderful look at his book Other Inquisitions. He's got an essay in there on biography, and he said it's all a question of putting into words. And as soon as you begin the process of putting into words, you're into a linguistic realm which gestures in the direction of something we call reality, but nobody from Plato to Aristotle has been able to figure out what that is.
Right, but we can do
Right.
this ontological stuff.
But
you know,
we're creating a fabric, a texture.
out
That's
of
what a text
facts.
is.
Out of
We're
facts.
weaving
out of facts. Out of facts.
As is a novel made up out of facts. Yeah.
Can I ask a different question? I mean, what intrigues me in the panel as we have it here is, why are there 6 or 7 biographies of Cummings, including Richard Kennedy's? Why are there 5 easily by Lillian Hellman? Why is there none of Malcolm Cowley?
That's a really good question.
And what sort of
I'm
forces
surprised.
what sort of forces do make for these happenings? Is it the lying, distrust dimension that?
Of Lillian
Is this-
Hellman,
I mean-
she was certainly, she intrigued a lot of people. She was such a strange person and a forceful person. And many biographers were women, and she was for a time a feminist ideal. So there are a number of biographies of her, and the facts of her life are interesting to think about and to write about and to read about. The lying is interesting.
But is it also the literary politics of the situation? I mean, my sense has sometimes been that Cowley gained a lot of attention in the last 10 years of his life. I mean, all sorts of honors. I mean, he was really not appreciated in New York City, but his reputation outside of New York was relatively high, certainly in the southern states. I mean, with the southern magazines like Sewanee Review, Georgia Review, etc. Then he sort of sank into obscurity, and my sense is that he sank into obscurity largely because of, let's say, the kind of canon wars that were going on in the United States, you know, in the 1990s.
Canon wars.
This was, you know, the time when you were supposed to focus on issues of class, gender, and race. And Cowley happened to have constructed a canon of American literature which was dominated by white male writers. So he fell out of favor, right?
But also, Cowley was an editor, a helper. I don't know what the literary word is for this. In other words, if he had only written Exile's Return, for instance,
Yeah.
then it would be a different situation. But he overwhelmed his own work in a way that Pound, for instance, did not. Although Pound, you know, we have another talk about blot. But, you know, the person who helps other people, I think, often gets less attention than the other people themselves, right? Now, there is a
Not
biography
so
of
much
Max Perkins,
just
but
helping other people, it's also creating an entire image of the story of American literature, which sort of has been subverted by subsequent scholarship. And the interesting thing is that the subsequent scholarship often is not built on things that Cowley had first and quite innovatively discovered, right? So why should we now then bring him back into the limelight is another question. Well,
Would there be an audience for a biography of Malcolm Cowley now? I do think biographies get written of people for whom there is an audience to hear about them. I think people probably want to read about, there will be enough people who want to read about Cummings and Lillian Hellman still, because their reputations continue to some degree. Certain people are interesting for a period.
Well, but also I think it depends a lot, or I hope it depends a lot on, and now I'm going to agree with you, on how the biography is written. In other words, if it's if it's fun to read, people will read it. If it's not fun to read, it's a higher bar there. You're just adding to the historical record, et cetera, et cetera.
No one's going to read a brilliant biography of Trumbull Stickney.
You know, they might.
I don't
they
know.
might. I mean, if it was really,
Maybe.
if it was
No,
really
I don't think
brilliant.
so. Well, maybe.
I'm getting interested.
You're interested in Trumbull Stickney.
Well, what a great name
Trumbull
for
Stickney.
openers.
I always love the story too. When Sinclair Lewis published Main Street in 1922, he wanted to make sure that the literary establishment of the day would be approving of him, and so he dedicated the book to the two greatest writers alive at the time. And he said, "This book is dedicated to the great authors of our day in fiction: Joseph Hergesheimer and James Branch Cabell." And in 1922, I swear to you, there would be nobody in this room, if we were sitting here then, who wouldn't have agreed the two great novelists in American literature were Joseph Hergesheimer, author of the immortal Java Head, and James Branch Cabell.
What do you think makes somebody's work survive?
Survive? I think this is, I'd like to bring it right back to that, because I firmly believe, like I said when I was talking to you about the Cummings, what makes a reputation survive is really, really, really original good work.
Excellence.
And I think that,
So you think James Branch Cabell was not a good novelist?
I don't think so. I read some James Branch Cabell, and it was unbelievably unreadable.
Okay.
The Yale class of 1920 did a survey. Who is the greatest American author of all time? And there was near unanimity. Or no, not the greatest author in the world of all time, great in fiction. And everybody thought the greatest novel of all time was Lorna Doone by R.P., what's his name? Blackmore. And who reads, what's the guy's name? I once tried to read Lorna Doone, and it's
Not Richard Blackmore, no.
not R.P. What was the guy's name? Blackmore. Who wrote Lorna Doone? Blackmore. I think his name was Blackmore. Not R.P. Blackmore, the Princeton
Not
critic.
right.
The guy with a very similar name. But 1920. By 1920, that book was published in 1869. So for 51 years, it had retained enough of a following
Wow.
that people at Yale in 1920 said, "This is the great work of fiction, Lorna
Nobody
Doone."
disagrees that the great eraser in the sky does not keep moving endlessly. People get swallowed up, and Shakespeare survives. There's only one Shakespeare who
Right.
survived.
And probably Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, and
Maybe.
John Cheever will survive, I would think.
But you think it's excellence, that's the key.
I think the key is your father wrote a handful of stories that most people would go to the guillotine for. They're so great. And I
He
think
wrote some
that's
great
true.
stories.
Yeah. The great stories. I mean, I've gone back to those stories again and again and again. My students have again and again. Every one of my students who doesn't know who Norman Mailer is, believe me, they've read the great Cheever stories.
They've read
So
some
that's
good
the
stories.
difference.
Yeah.
Well, so let's, go ahead.
Can I sort of pitch in here just a little bit? I mean, I fully agree. It's the excellence of the work that sort of, makes whether a book survives or not, continues to live, so to speak. But it also helps, I mean, what about the forces of the literary marketplace? It helps to have certain people who have an intuition for excellence, so to speak, and who can sort of, bring excellence forward and make
Like
sure that it's
Malcolm,
actually
right.
published.
And Cowley
Right?
did
So
that.
Cowley
He did
read
that.
thousands and thousands of anonymous works and manuscripts, and he was able to sort of select precisely those 3 that were worth publishing and that actually stood
But we
the
don't
tooth
know
of
that,
time.
do we?
We
don't
don't
know.
know that, but no, I know. But I mean, he had a kind of intuition or whatever it was for these things, and he fought. I mean, if he hadn't fought for Kerouac, if he hadn't fought for Ken Kesey,
No, we
might
don't.
not have had
What I
these
meant was we don't know what he overlooked. Those thousands and thousands and thousands.
They might have
sure that
been.
he missed a couple of things too.
But this
Yes,
is the
yeah.
beauty of biography. You can hitch your wagon to a star. You can find somebody who has stood the test of time
Yeah,
and write about them.
you can. Or you can waste an awful lot of years on somebody unimportant.
Yeah.
That's right. Or you can waste an awful lot of years on someone who has stood the test of time.
You might as well waste your time on somebody good.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, let's end it here, okay? Do we take questions from the crowd? Let's take a couple of questions. There's a question down here. Yes.
I used to work at Norton, and in the middle 90s, Laura Ryan Jackson sued W.W. Norton for not being included in the Norton Book of 20th Century American Poetry. The point is, that part of the carrying on of literary fame is done through anthologies and in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And what tends to survive is what ends up being selected from those anthologies and therefore taught. And I wonder if you would weigh in on that process.
I think you're absolutely right. The classroom is the place where writers survive who might not survive otherwise.
But it's also nice if an author has voluntary readers, people who really go to the book because they love the book. I think sometimes things that are taught over. My third kid just graduated from high school last year, and he said to me, "Why, from 7th grade through 12th grade, every single year did I have to read To Kill a Mockingbird and J.D. Salinger's novel, Catcher in the Rye?" He said, "I came to truly hate those books." And
Every year he had to read them?
every single year, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades,
Not a great high
He
school.
was assigned To Kill a Mockingbird and The Catcher in the Rye. So, complicated. What?
Yeah.
Bad school.
Bad
Another
school.
question. Yes, Denisha.
Hi, Denisha.
The nature of biography. I think what goes on is an implied contract, a presumed contract
There you
between
go.
the writer and the reader,
Yeah.
that what you're presenting is truth. That most readers, contemporary readers, assume it's truth. And that's the key here. You can't just disregard it and say, I'm writing what I feel happened on that sunny day when the guy crossed the street.
Right. I'm just suggesting it's more complicated. It's sort of like Pontius Pilate. What is truth?
Oh, well, that's such a big question.
Well, but I think you're right that now I'm going to go didactic, that every opening paragraph is a contract with the reader, and that when you say to the reader, this is a biography,
Yeah.
what that means to the reader is you don't make up facts.
Yeah.
The reader knows well that it's your interpretation,
Your interpretation of the facts and your arrangement of the facts, and also the reader knows it's your prerogative to suppress certain facts.
The reader knows that, but let me say, I wrote a biography of Bill Wilson, and there's a scene after he has his first drink, which, as he says, is the elixir of life, and he goes out into a driveway, and he hears a saxophone playing, and he feels that he's found the elixir of life, and everywhere I go, people are, how did you know that? In other words, it's a letter, but that thing of being inside, I think the reader expects in a biography, if you say he was very depressed,
Yeah.
that there is a reason that you're able to say that.
Yeah. There's a question.
Biographer, do you think it's possible for you to understand your subject better than they understood themselves?
Yes.
That's not hard.
Yeah, probably the hardest person to understand is yourself. And so somewhere I read, though, that biography is the truest form of autobiography.
Ooh.
And that really got me thinking. And I do think that that could produce a nice essay for someone. Because I do think that you inevitably, when you're presented with the agreed upon facts of the life of John Doe, Susie Doe, you're bringing to bear against that paradigm your own experience. And so when that person, it doesn't get into the college of his or her choice, just making this up, you're remembering, oh, that day I didn't get accepted at Harvard. right? And you bring a certain amount of passion to bear on this part of the book,
That was a bad day.
right?
I would modify your question just a little bit and ask it differently in the sense that, does a biographer have to like the subject he or she is writing about?
But Dorothy
so,
so
he
magnificently
doesn't, yeah.
answered that question.
And to what extent is it necessary for a good biography to come into being? I mean, working on Cowley, I've gained an acute sense of the man's strengths and weaknesses as I went along. So you see the accents of the landscape, so to speak, much more in sharp relief as you go along. But I think I would find it very difficult to continue working on Cowley if I dislike the man as fiercely as you seem to be disliking Lillian Hellman.
Gives you a lot of energy, dislike.
Yeah,
I think a good biographer has a lover's quarrel
Yeah,
with his
yeah.
subject.
like
Certainly.
Frost.
Certainly.
A lover's quarrel with
Quoting
the world.
Frost's epitaph. He had a lover's quarrel with the world.
Well, no, that's true. If you write a biography of Hitler, but there aren't that many subjects that are so relentlessly awful, right? I mean, maybe. Yes?
In this age of infinite supply, why should there be a canon? In other words, why should there be people who become famous when there are so many people who are interested?
Well, there always will be certain people that more people are interested in reading than others.
There will be a canon whether you like it or not,
Yeah, you
right? I
can't
mean, Malcolm
stop it.
Cowley talked about the literary
The
stock
canons are
exchange.
going to go boom, 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 whether you like it or not.
But isn't it like you said, you don't know what you don't know?
Did you say that?
Did I say that?
I think
I don't
Dorothy said
know.
that.
We're going to
No,
accuse
I
you of
didn't.
that, Dorothy.
Are we in danger of missing?
Well, people drop in and out of the canon all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, look at a syllabus from 1960 and look at a syllabus from now for a class on, say, contemporary poetry. Totally different list. No comparison. I mean, I don't teach any of the same poets in my contemporary poetry class now that I taught in 1974. Almost none. They're completely, I was looking at it the other day, I saw a syllabus. You know, in 1975 at Dartmouth, I had 3 weeks on the poetry of Greg Kuzma. Nowadays, has anybody ever heard of Greg Kuzma? At the time, I thought he was the most important poet in America. So these things shift.
Well, think of the case of John Williams. You know, why all of a sudden now are people reading Stoner and Butcher's Crossing? At least in the Netherlands they are. And why not in 1960 when the books came out?
Well, thank you all for listening to us. I appreciate it.